This is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and this will be the last episode for real covering Bloomburrow. Next week we will be on First Look at Duskmorn. Today I will be talking about red-green in Bloomburrow. As always, the notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. Red-green is the least drafted and least successful non-blue archetype, ahead of Izzet, Dimir, and Azorius. Simic is actually the third most successful and fourth most drafted archetype. Despite being blue, the top archetypes are all green. Simic is green. Red-green is the worst green archetype, and the second worst red archetype, which is interesting. It's interesting that it's the second worst red archetype, given that green is the best color. Clearly, the synergies here are coming together a little bit less than the synergies with some of the other colors. In my, 82 drafts now, I have drafted red-green 0 times. You'll note that I'm recording a podcast about it, despite the fact that I've recorded it no times. This is what happens when I choose what to talk about based on a Patreon poll. I think people are maybe interested in hearing about what I have to say about it. Given that I haven't drafted it, maybe thoughts on why I haven't or what's going on here. It's not that I think that red-green is bad exactly. It's fine. I've gotten run over by it. It's that I think it's not fun or interesting. I'm basically fully antagonistic to this archetype, largely from a design perspective. I think expend is a really bad mechanic. There's very little you can do in a draft to make it happen, especially in an archetype that basically just wants to play large creatures on curve, and especially when the payoff for expend is kind of just your creatures are bigger on your turn, so you really have to be aggressive with it. Conceptually, it rewards you for drawing more cards so that you can spend more mana casting spells. But in practice, that's not what's going on with red-green here. If the mechanic cared about what you were spending your mana on, or if some non-spell things that you could spend mana on, some or all, counted toward expend, then it would be a lot more interesting to draft. As is, it just has no texture whatsoever. There's nothing you can do in a draft to be better or worse at expending, especially when it's in an archetype that's just trying to curve out creatures and removal spells and cast your spells on curve. So it basically just rewards drawing well rather than any sort of actual planning or consideration in the draft. So there's really nothing related to the expend mechanic specifically that you can meaningfully do in a draft to draft for it. So I don't really understand what I'm supposed to find interesting about it from a drafting perspective. So I don't like it. I think it's just a bad mechanic. What's the point of having a mechanic that doesn't provide any direction or nuance to decision making during a draft when it's clearly a mechanic that's targeted at limited? I feel like there are a lot of things that could have been done slightly differently with it to give it some amount of play. And I frequently talk about how I think that the red-green set mechanic in a lot of sets has been pretty bad, and it results in red-green not being a fun or interesting or powerful archetype to draft. And I think there were a few sets that made some progress on that and did some better things with it. And I think that expend is a pretty big step backwards. There's just nothing I like about this. The primary reason to draft red-green is that the red-green gold cards are strong. Specifically, Wandertail Mentor, the red-green uncommon 2/2 that taps for red or green mana and gets a +1/+1 counter on it when you expend. is very strong and not really splashable. So all of the copies that are opened just end up in red-green decks. Given that the only real reason I could see to draft red-green was, well, at least you get to use the Wandertail mentors, I decided to do a little bit of research. On Untapped, 63% of red-green decks that trophy have Wandertail mentor. Now, obviously just saying 63% probably doesn't mean a lot. So, for context, I compared it to some of the other good mentors. For example, Lily Splash Mentor is a card that similarly basically all blue-green decks want, and blue-green decks are going to win more when they have it. And 56% of blue-green decks that trophy have Lily Splash Mentor. Similar point of comparison is Vine Reap Mentor, which, obviously all green-black decks want. It's the top performing uncommon, so having it's going to correlate strongly with winning. 58% of green-black decks that trophy have Vine Reap Mentor. So 5 and 7% more of the red-green decks that trophy have their mentor than the Simic or Golgari decks. And so, I'm saying, it's not just that, Wandertail Mentor is better. It's not. It's just that I think the other color combinations have more going on, more other reasons to draft them, and more other reasons that they would be successful. Whereas a larger portion of the success and reason to draft red-green is coming from Wandertail Mentor specifically. Also, the red-green rares / mythics are also good and reasons to be red-green. They're strong rares. It makes sense to me that not all red-green decks the trophy have Wandertail Mentor or something, but it is a huge part of what's happening here. As for other individual cards, the common red and green removal spells all perform well enough that you'd want to consider playing them. Every single red or green common that can kill a creature, all of them, for example, perform better than 3-Tree Rootweaver, the 1/3 that taps for a mana of any color, which I mentioned because the Rootweaver is somewhat overplayed and really not what this deck is trying to do, even though you might want to play an above normal density of 4 mana cards, and so being able to cast a 4 starting on turn 3 and then cast more 4s seems kind of appealing. That's just you want a more normal aggro curve than that. It's better to just play a 2-drop that has an aggressively statted 2-drop, then an aggressively statted 3-drop, then start playing your 4-drops. And Rootweaver is just going to be a terrible draw anytime other than exactly turn 2. And you're going to want to play Rootweaver. If you're playing Rootweaver, you're still going to want aggressive 2s. So you have to figure out, is it better to, if your hand has both a Rootweaver and an aggressive 2, which one of those do you cast on turn 2? And it kind of has to be the Rootweaver, but it's, really not helping that hand very much to do that. So avoid that one. The top common creatures are Treeguard Duo, the frog rabbit 4-mana 3/4 that when it enters gives something +X/+O in vigilance for X the number of creatures you control. Baker's Bane Duo, the 2/2 that makes a food for 2 and when you expend gets +1/+1. Root Shield Rampager, the 4-mana 4/4 with Offspring that can't be blocked by smaller creatures. Junkblade Bruiser, the 5-mana 4/5 that when you expend gets +2/+1 and trample. Alania's Pathmaker, the 4-mana 4/2 that bottles the top card of your deck. And Roughshod Duo, the 3-mana 3/2 trample that when you expend gives something +1/+0 and trample. Those are most of the common creatures that you want to play. You're basically, to the extent that you're playing commons, you want to play those creatures and all of the removal and High Stride, the 1 green +1/+3 untap and give reach trick. This is, I think, the color combination that's most interested in High Stride, and it's pretty good here. Notably, you play the kind of creatures that play well with the kind of trick that High Stride is. The bigger your creature is, the more you want your trick to give toughness relative to power, and the bigger your creature is, the more stuff like untapping and getting reach matters. And the clunkier your deck is, the more like the 1 mana play is important, and the more like untapping and ambushing a flyer is going to be important to swinging a race. Also, it's nice to have some 1 mana tricks in this archetype for spots where you like play a roughshod duo on 3 and then play another 3-drop on 4, and then you have a 1 mana trick so that you can trigger expend at instant speed to kind of turn your 1 trick into 2 tricks. That's kind of like the most interesting thing you can do with expend is trigger it at instant speed, ideally for less than 4 mana because you've already spent some of the mana and most likely on your turn. Though that's really like a complete list of commons that you want to be playing. You know, you can play some of the other creatures if you came up short on the ideal ones. You generally want the ones that are more aggressive in some way. Due to the more or less complete lack of any relevant synergy in this archetype, and the fact that expend largely forgives bad curves, I think that this is the archetype where this is the kind of archetype where I would feel most comfortable basically just like pulling up the the game in hand win rate stats and just taking the highest win rate card in your colors every pick. It might be like there will be times when, you know, you'll make a suboptimal pick if you do that, but I think on average they'll be pretty rare, and I think that drafting strictly by stats would outperform most drafters drafting just based on like not knowing the stats and taking cards that look good or whatever. Trophy decks in this archetype or color combination typically seem to have like between 15 and 19 creatures. Makes sense that you want a high density of creatures given, or like, yeah, you want a lot of creatures because there are a lot of strong fight spells in green. Like you want your brawls and your polywallops, and those need you to have creatures in play. You also have the Rabid Gnaw in red. So you want to play a bunch of cards and Hunter's Talent. Like there are a lot of cards you want to play that only work if you have a creature. Also, you don't really have like card advantage. So, and you don't have a lot of synergy. So this is a deck that like really wants to be ending the game. Also, like once you've used the cards in your hand, then your expend becomes much less reliable and your deck just like works less well in the late game. So you really want to be ending the games. You want to make sure that you have like a large number of aggressively statted creatures. But removal is also very good because your low synergy and your creatures are independently high impact. So like removal lets you break up your opponent's synergies so that your larger creatures just kind of beat up on their smaller creatures, and that's sort of the end of the story. So you want a high creature count, but also a high removal count, which is to say you don't want much other stuff. And yeah, basically you don't want anything fancy or tricky. You don't want to spend mana on something that isn't like a creature or a removal spell, because your goal ultimately is to connect with creatures, and you want to like do that in the timeliest fashion, put the most pressure on your opponents. So something like a cash grab that could potentially slow your development down, even though it's a way to spend more mana to trigger expend, is not actually worth it. Same thing with like Sazakap's Brawl. the Tormenting Voice variant. All of that stuff would be like fancy stuff that it would be cool if this deck wanted to give some like texture to expend, but the reality of like the cards involved and the other incentives is that you just don't want to mess around with any of that stuff. So that's kind of what I have to say about red green, mostly why I don't like it, but also like from a design standpoint, not a power level standpoint, but also, you know, a little bit about how to draft it and why. So anyway, that's what I have. I'm mostly just antagonistic toward this archetype, but I do want to make sure to, you know, give the applicable strategy advice to people who are interested in that. Although I suppose it's convenient that this is approaching the end of the format, so a time when it makes more sense to, I guess, focus more on like design considerations and stuff to think about in a broader context, and where like strategy advice for this particular set may not matter quite as much. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to Twitch chat for additional questions while I'm waiting for people to submit some of those. I do want to thank the newest patrons. So thank you, Ryan and Vixisto. Really appreciate the support. For anyone else who is interested in joining the Patreon and supporting the podcast, be sure to check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. All right, so questions from chat. Do you not like red-green because it doesn't use Barkform Harvester? No, I don't like red-green for the reasons that I said, but it is true that red-green is an absolutely terrible Barkform Harvester deck. In fact, the stats on Untapped that kind of break things into tiers have Barkform Harvester as the sole F-tier performing card in red-green, the single worst performing card by enough that it got its own category. And I, as a, you know, general like Barkform Harvester apologist and someone who's inclined to explain why it might make sense in some places where the stats aren't good, would agree. Red-green has no interest in Barkform Harvester. Can I say more about why the bigger your creatures are, the more you want combat tricks to give toughness relative to power? Yes. If you have a 1/1 and your opponent has a 3/3 or a 4/4, you want a combat trick that's going to give you like 2 or 3 extra power so that you can trade your 1/1 for their bigger creature. You don't really care very much if the trick also gives you enough toughness to keep your 1/1 because it was a 1/1, and you're at the stage in the game where your opponent has much larger creatures than that. If, conversely, I have a 4/4 and you have a 1/1, and you use a trick to get your creature to be bigger than mine, then all I need is a trick that's going to give me enough toughness to save my creature. More likely what's going to be happening is you're going to be double blocking. And in that context, I'm likely to be able to kill both your creatures with any sort of pump. But if I only kill one creature, that's fine too. The thing I really care about is saving my big creature. Like, it's a big creature, I've spent a lot of mana on it, I don't want it to go away. And toughness is what's going to let me keep that creature when it gets, like, double blocked. Also, tricks that give toughness functionally counter removal spells that attack toughness, that being both -X and damage-based removal. With small creatures, you don't care very much about saving it, so you don't really care about your tricks being able to save your small creatures from removal spells. But with your big creatures, it's more important that your trick can be used as a counterspell for a removal spell. So toughness-weighted tricks double down on virtual card advantage. I'd say more they protect your investment, but you can think of that as doubling down on virtual card advantage. Could I talk about Agate Assault's underperformance in red-green relative to other archetypes? Is it just difficult to expend 4 with a 3-mana spell, or is the effect also less interesting in red-green? I think it's mostly that red green's worse. Like, I don't think assault does like I don't think that assault is significantly lower on the list of successful red commons. I think if you're looking at it and like red green wins or like assault wins 1% less in red green than it does in red black or something, I would want to see how much of that is a function of like red green winning 1% fewer of its matches than red black. I didn't notice assault as a card that was like low on the list of commons, like red commons that you want. Its assault is a little. It's game in hand. Its win rate's a little bit worse than conductless electricity in red green. Interesting. Yeah, I think that's more about conduct electricity getting a buff from being an instant speed way to expend for. But I talk about the aggro decks wanting big like hard removal spells and control decks wanting like cheap efficient removal spells. So this kind of ties back into the like aggro decks being play creatures, then play spells, control decks being play spells, then play creatures. So given that red green is an aggro deck and that red green is going to struggle with big creatures, it makes sense that the hard removal that's like a little bit like clunkier, even aside from the expend, is going to be more of a priority in red green than it would be in some of the other archetypes that are more capable of playing red as support for a longer game. So I think mostly what you're seeing is conduct electricity overperforming in red green, but also, yes, to some extent, assault, like 3 mana exactly, is a bit worse than more than 3 mana or less than three. Like the just doesn't trigger expend is certainly a bit of a downside. It matters less on creatures that you're curving out with because like you want to be able to play a 3-drop on turn 3, but like assault's not a card that you're hoping to cast on turn 3, so you're going to be casting it later in the game where you would rather it cost a different amount of mana. Do you draft the deck differently when you have Mura Trash Tactician, the rare that has the expend 8 clause? Like, do you want to build toward the expend 8 using card draw / cantrips? I don't think so. I think that, like, if I were doing that, it would be in a 3-color deck that was, like, playing this card and playing cards from other colors that let me play a different game plan with, like, actual card advantage to be hitting my land drops. And most of the time that you're, like, actually red-green with the Trash Tactician, I think you just want to be a normal deck that might happen to, like, hit the expend 8 in the late game, but that's, like, incidental and not, like, a big part of your strategy. If they didn't have the mana to cast spells restrictions, do you think expend would be a better / more interesting mechanic? Yeah, I do. I originally thought, like, I originally misread it and thought that it worked when you just spent mana on anything. And I thought that it was, like, cool because it gave context to, like, wanting to look for, like, talents and equipment and other mana sinks to, like, have something to spend mana on to trigger expend. And when it's just spells, I just feel like you can't do anything with it. You can't draft around it. Obviously, maybe it would need to be balanced a little bit differently if there were like more inputs that triggered it. But I think that basically any variant on what it is would be better than what came out because there's just nothing do with this. You can't draft around it. It's just literally take any card. So I would have liked any amount of, it only works for certain kinds of spells. It also works for certain kind of abilities. Even something as simple as, oh, it only works for like red or green spells. So you like really can't splash or whatever. Just like anything to give it some context. would have helped. In this sort of situation where the payoffs for an archetype aren't really worth pursuing, should I try to make something generic like red-green combat tricks to see if there's some alternate way to play the deck? So the problem is there just aren't very many red or green combat tricks, and the like the Might of the Meek doesn't play well here. Like giving trample's cool, but you have other ways to give trample, and without caring about Valiant and without getting extra power from having a mouse, it's just not a good card. And so in general, I do like my red green aggressive decks to have a lot of combat tricks. But I just those cards aren't there, so you have to play removal instead. And again, because your creatures are generally bigger than other colors creatures and less synergistic, it just makes sense to have removal to break up their synergies and make sure that you can attack, to clear double blocks and stuff. You should pursue something generic, but it's kind of just mandated that it has to be maximally generic. It has to just be creatures and removal spells. And I mean talents. Obviously the talents are just good cards, and you can play them too. Blacksmith talent works fine here. You have a lot of trample creatures that are big, so giving them double strike is powerful. Never drafting in 80 drafts. Is there anything that could put you into red green? Yeah, I think Hugs is really good, and I'll first pick Hugs. And then if there's not something that pulls me into a different color where I'm splashing, I'm some kind of 3-color Hugs deck, which is my expectation when I take Hugs. And then if I get some Wandertail mentors that really don't want me to be splashing, I would kind of lean into that. Or if there's just a weak pack with Wandertail Mentor, and then I get some other cards that don't lend themselves to splashing and do lend themselves to attacking. Those are the kinds of things that would get me to draft it, but everything it's trying to do is just very much not what I'm interested in doing generally or looking to do in this set, so it would certainly require some pretty extreme packs. Overall thoughts on Bloomburrow as I wrap up? That's a fair question, given that this is the closing episode on the topic. X out of 10. I'm not going to give it a score out of 10. I don't really like trying to rank sets for a lot of reasons, but I have enjoyed it. I like the depth in the set. I feel like there's both a lot of ability for me to explore wacky multicolor control nonsense that doesn't really care about a lot of the explicit set themes and type synergies, and also for someone who's looking for a simpler experience with more hand holding, you can just choose a type and draft around it and end up with playable deck, and depending on which type you choose, it might have some pretty fun and interesting synergies. I think it has a nice spread of interesting build arounds that take you outside of some of the core mechanics with enough depth and power and synergy in the kind of core mechanics and scripted archetypes that I think it has obvious entry points plus room to explore plus room for fringe decks with kind of unexpected overlaps and neat discoverable synergies. And I've found the gameplay pretty fun and interesting. And I think the position of blue is pretty good, where it's not performing well in aggregate, but I know a lot of strong players like it, but still are kind of doing different things with it. So all of that seems pretty nice to me. Yeah, so I think that I like the set overall. I think that some of the types are like much better supported and much more interesting than others. I think expend is really bad. I think the birds are basically a miss. Like they're low power level, low synergy, low density, like nothing really appealing about them. I think we're like a cheap common otter short of otters being in a place I'd be happy with. Bird are birds a miss balance wise, design wise, or both? Kind of both. Like their like central conceit being like birds plus non-birds is like weird and doesn't really make a ton of sense with the rest of the set and isn't very appealing. It's like, hey, you like birds? What if you played not birds instead? Like, who is that for? And then also, it's just a lot of like, Windrake's not that bad, right, guys? No, Windrake's really that bad. So I don't know. I think birds are just kind of a miss all around. Anyway, yeah, I think that's basically my thoughts on Bloomburrow as a set. And that seems like a pretty reasonable place to wrap up my coverage of Bloomburrow. So thanks everyone for listening, and I will be back next week to take an early look at Duskmorn. Bye for now.
Prepare for light speed.